The storm did not arrive the way ordinary storms arrive. It did not roll in from the sea, nor did it drift down from the northern passes as the old shepherds had come to expect after decades of reading the sky. This storm rose from the mountain itself, as though the stone had exhaled a breath it had been holding for 1,000 years. The clouds gathered around the highest peak in slow, deliberate spirals, black and heavy, laced with veins of red lightning that never quite touched the ground. And in the valley below, where a small village of stone cottages huddled around a crooked wooden chapel, every candle was extinguished, every door was bolted, and every mother pulled her children a little closer beneath their blankets. They had lived like this for generations. They had learned to live like this. The castle above them, half swallowed by mist, half carved into the cliff itself, was older than the village, older than the kingdom, older than the language they spoke. And the thing that lived inside it was older still. The elders did not say his name aloud. They only said the word him, and everyone understood. Travelers who wandered too close to the forest at the base of the mountain were never seen again. Wagons found on the roads were always empty. Blood on the stones was always fresh, though no bodies were ever recovered. And every child in the village grew up learning the same lesson, taught not through books but through fear passed from grandmother to grandchild in the dark hours before dawn. Never approach the castle. Never speak his name. Never look toward the tower after sunset. Inside that tower on that particular night, Dracula stood at a tall arched window and watched the storm with the calm satisfaction of a man watching his own garden grow. He had lived long enough to understand whether the way other men understood their own moods. This storm belonged to him, or so he believed. His long fingers rested on the cold stone sill, and his pale eyes moved across the valley below with a familiar hunger that had softened, over centuries, into something closer to boredom. He had drunk from kings. He had corrupted saints. He had watched empires rise and rot and vanish beneath the soil, and he had remained unchanged, unchallenged, unafraid. There was no god left who frightened him. There was no army left who could reach him. There was no judgment left in the world that could touch a creature who had already outlived every judge. And then, without warning, the air split open. It happened at the edge of the forest, in a clearing where no clearing had existed the day before. The trees leaned back as though repelled by something they could not name. The ground softened, the frost curled into black petals. And a wound opened in the world itself, a jagged seam of red and violet light that pulsed like something alive and breathing. From that wound, a figure stepped forward. He did not fall. He did not stumble. He walked, slowly, deliberately, as though he had been expected. His cloak moved without wind. His chains dragged behind him and left faint scars of green fire smoldering in the wet earth. His face was hidden. His eyes were not. In the highest tower of the castle, Dracula went very still. For the first time in more than 500 years, the vampire lord felt something he could not immediately name. It was not fear. Fear was a word for smaller creatures. It was recognition. A shape moving through the forest below carried a presence that did not belong to any bloodline Dracula had ever tasted, any demon he had ever bargained with, any angel he had ever driven away. This was something else. Something older in spirit, though perhaps younger in years. Something that had walked through fire and come back carrying the fire with him. Dracula smiled, because smiling was what he did when he did not understand. He turned from the window and let his servants know, without speaking, that a guest had arrived. The castle responded the way it always responded. Corridors darkened. Doors unlocked themselves. The great iron gates at the base of the mountain groaned open on hinges that had not moved in a century. And the things that lived in the walls, the pale, thin, hungry things that Dracula had made and kept and forgotten, crawled out into the courtyard to greet the stranger. They did not last long. The first wave met him at the gate and ended before it began. The second wave met him at the courtyard and ended between two heartbeats. The third wave, the strongest, the oldest, the ones Dracula had personally trained during the years of the First Crusades, met him on the great stone staircase, and their bodies fell in silence, because whatever this stranger carried in his hands did not permit them the dignity of screaming. Within minutes, the castle was quiet again. Not the quiet of victory, the quiet of an emptied room. From the shadow of the highest balcony, Dracula watched the intruder step over the ruined bodies of his oldest servants without looking down at them. He watched him raise his gaze, slowly, deliberately, toward the tower. He watched the hood shift, only slightly, and reveal a mask carved from something that was not metal and not bone. And in that single moment the vampire lord understood, with a clarity that struck him like cold water, that this stranger had not come to bargain. He had not come to fight. He had not come to conquer. He had come to deliver judgment. The castle had a memory of its own. Every stone in every wall carried a stain of something Dracula had once done, and if a visitor knew how to listen, the corridors themselves would whisper the confessions the vampire lord had long since stopped making. Spawn listened. He walked through the great gallery on the second floor, where enormous portraits stared down at him from centuries of gilded frames. Each painting showed the same face, only the clothing changed. In one, Dracula wore the armor of a warlord, standing over a battlefield of the dead. In another, he wore the robes of a nobleman, hosting a feast at a long table where the guests looked pale and afraid. In another, he wore the vestments of a priest, holding a chalice that was almost certainly not filled with wine. The dates on the frame spanned 5 centuries. The eyes in every portrait were the same. Spawn stopped in front of one and considered it for a long time. In this one, the vampire was younger, or at least appeared younger, and he was dressed in the simple wool of a mortal prince. There was something almost human about the expression, a trace of grief perhaps, a trace of doubt. It was the only portrait in the entire gallery where Dracula did not look proud. Spawn understood, without needing to be told, that this was the last portrait of the man before the bargain. Everything after this frame was the creature. He moved on. Beyond the gallery, a spiral staircase descended into the crypts. The air grew colder with every step, not from temperature but from something older, something spiritual, something that lived beneath cold. And in the crypts, Spawn found the truth of what Dracula had built. There were cells. Row after row of iron cages, some occupied by things that had once been human and were now something less, others occupied by villagers whose eyes had gone dim from years of captivity. There were altars stained with a rust that was not rust. There were books bound in materials that Spawn recognized immediately, because he had seen the same materials in hell. He began, quietly and without announcement, to open the cages. He did not speak to the prisoners. He did not need to. His chains reached out and touched the locks, and the locks understood, and the doors swung open, and one by one the captives stumbled into the corridor and found their way toward the surface. Some wept, some collapsed. Some simply walked in silence, unable to remember what daylight felt like. Dracula watched all of this from the throne room above, through the eyes of the castle itself. He did not intervene, not yet. He was studying his visitor the way a scholar studies a new species of predator. He noticed that Spawn had not once looked toward the throne. He noticed that Spawn had not once accelerated his pace. He noticed that Spawn seemed less interested in reaching him than in emptying the cages he passed along the way. And this, more than anything else, disturbed the vampire lord. Because Dracula had spent centuries assuming that every creature who entered his castle wanted what he wanted. Power, recognition, the satisfaction of standing over another and being obeyed. Spawn did not want any of these things, which meant Spawn could not be bought, could not be flattered, could not be turned, which meant Dracula would have to try something else. He reached out with his mind and pressed a vision into the corridor. The air shimmered, the walls dissolved, and suddenly Spawn was standing in a field of banners under a red sun, watching a younger Dracula lead an army against a city that no longer existed on any map. The vision unfolded with pride. The vampire had chosen his most triumphant memory. He wanted his visitor to see him at the height of his mortal glory, when he had still been a prince and not yet a monster, when men had followed him into fire because they believed in him. He wanted Spawn to feel the weight of his history. He wanted Spawn to hesitate. Spawn did not hesitate. He walked through the vision as though it were smoke. The field dissolved behind him. The banners fell. The sun went out. And when he emerged on the other side, he was still in the corridor, still moving, still opening cages. Dracula tried again. This time he did not offer glory. This time he offered accusation. The corridor shifted, and suddenly Spawn was standing in an alley in a city that did not belong to this century, and a man he had once been was dying in the arms of a woman he had once loved, and the smell of gasoline and burning flesh filled the air. Dracula had reached deep. Dracula had found Al Simmons. And Dracula smiled from his throne, because he was certain no creature could walk past its own death without flinching. Spawn stopped. For the first time he stopped. But he did not flinch. He looked at the memory the way a man looks at an old scar. He acknowledged it. He accepted it. And then he continued walking, and the memory dissolved behind him like the others, and Dracula, on his throne, felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest. He tried to speak. His voice traveled through the walls, ancient and smooth, the voice of a man who had convinced kings to kneel with nothing more than a whisper. He told Spawn that every creature carried darkness inside it. He told him that morality was a story invented by the weak to comfort themselves against the strong. He told him that judgment was a lie, because there was no one left in the universe qualified to deliver it. He told him that immortality had shown him the truth, that power was the only real currency, that the rest was decoration. Spawn finally answered. His voice was quiet. It did not echo. It did not need to. He said that Dracula was right about one thing. Everyone carried darkness. He carried more than most. He had killed. He had failed. He had lost people he was supposed to save. He knew the shape of his own darkness better than any priest, any philosopher, any vampire on any throne. But he had learned something Dracula never had. Darkness did not excuse the choice. The dark was not the verdict. What a creature did with its darkness was the verdict. And Dracula, for 500 years, had chosen the same thing every night, and every night the choice had been the wrong one. The throne room went very cold. Dracula stopped smiling. For the first time in centuries, he realized that the conversation was not one he could win with words. And that realization, quiet and unwelcome, was the first crack in a wall he had spent 500 years believing was unbreakable. Dracula did not send a warning. He did not deliver a threat. He simply closed his eyes, and every buried thing in the mountain woke up. Beneath the crypts, the older crypts opened. Beneath those, the oldest crypts opened. Stone lids that had not moved in 8 centuries slid aside with a grinding roar that traveled through the whole valley, and the villagers, hidden in their cellars, clutched their crosses tighter because they could feel, in their bones, that something enormous had just begun. Vampire knights climbed out of graves they had willingly entered during the plague years, still wearing the rusted armor of their long-dead kingdoms, still carrying the swords they had used against their own countrymen. Werewolves, chained for centuries in the lower kennels, tore free of their bindings and shook the dust of decades from their fur. Bats the size of horses unfolded from the rafters of the upper towers, their wings blotting out the little moonlight that reached the courtyards. Corpses stitched together from a dozen unlucky travelers rose from the flagstones. Ancient warriors, older than the castle itself, older than the family Dracula had been born into, opened their yellow eyes for the first time in a millennium. And into this rising army Spawn walked. He did not raise a weapon. He did not need to raise a weapon. His chains woke before he did. They uncoiled from his shoulders, from his waist, from the seams of his cloak, and they moved on their own, the way a serpent moves when it has decided the argument is over. The first vampire knight to reach him lost his sword, and then lost his arm, and then lost the memory of ever having been alive, all within the span of a single breath. The second was pulled through a stone wall so fast that the wall broke first. The third tried to retreat, and the chain found him anyway, because the chain had a longer memory than the vampire did. The corridors filled with noise, steel on stone, claw on bone, the wet, breathless sound of things that had no right to still be moving. Spawn moved through the noise the way a man walks through his own house in the dark, knowing where every door is, knowing where every enemy would try to hide. His necroplasmic energy rose in thin green tongues around his shoulders, and where the flame touched an ancient vampire, the vampire remembered briefly that he had once been human, and then remembered nothing at all. From his throne, Dracula watched, and Dracula learned. He had assumed at first that Spawn was simply strong. Strength he understood. Strength he could counter with numbers, with strategy, with the accumulated wisdom of 5 centuries of hunting stronger things than himself. But as the battle progressed, Dracula noticed something that troubled him deeply. Spawn was not merely powerful. Spawn was responsive. The more monstrous the creature that came at him, the more monstrous his power became in reply. When a common vampire attacked, the chain moved with an almost lazy precision. When something older attacked, something twisted, something Dracula had personally corrupted, the chain moved faster, brighter, angrier. It was as though Spawn's power fed on the concentration of evil in the room, and Dracula had spent the last 5 centuries turning his castle into a feast. The vampire lord adjusted. He always adjusted. He had survived the Crusades by adjusting, and he had survived every hunter since by refusing to fight the same battle twice. He pulled back the physical assault. He let the surviving werewolves scatter into the lower halls. He let the vampire knights fall back to the crypts to lick their wounds. And instead of throwing more monsters into the corridors, he transformed the corridors themselves. The castle began to breathe. Walls that had stood for 1,000 years peeled backward into darkness. Staircases twisted into shapes that no craftsman had ever designed. Rooms Spawn had already walked through appeared again in front of him, subtly different, subtly wrong. The paintings in the gallery began to speak. The mirrors in the corridors began to show a face that was not Spawn's. The floor began to remember every footstep that had ever been taken across it, and to remind Spawn of every one that had belonged to him. He saw the alley again. He saw his own body burning. He saw the woman he had loved standing at a window she had once stood at, and he saw the man who had taken his place, and he saw the child who should have been his, and had never been. He saw hell briefly, only a corner of it, only enough to remind him. He saw every failure he had carried into this castle, every soul he had promised to save, and had not saved in time, every promise made in the dark that the dark had eventually kept. Dracula's voice moved through the illusions like a conductor through an orchestra. He told Spawn that no creature could carry this much grief without breaking. He told him that every warrior eventually finds the wound that ends him, and this, he said, this castle, this labyrinth, this parade of memories, this was Spawn's wound. He invited him, almost gently, to sit down, to rest, to let the illusions do what illusions had done to every other visitor for 500 years. Spawn did not sit down. He kept walking. The illusions grew louder. The illusions grew crueler. The castle threw everything it had learned in 5 centuries of breaking men into the corridors around him. And still Spawn walked, and eventually he stopped in the middle of a hall that did not exist, and turned his masked face toward the ceiling, where he knew Dracula was watching. He said only one thing. He said that Dracula had made a mistake. He said that the vampire had assumed the castle could show him something worse than what he had already seen. But Spawn had been to hell. He had lived in hell. He had walked out of hell carrying pieces of it in his own chest. The castle, however old, however clever, however soaked in 5 centuries of stolen suffering, was still only a castle. It was a shadow of a shadow, and a man who had already walked through the fire could not be frightened by the smoke. The illusions collapsed. The corridors folded back into their proper shapes. The paintings went silent. The mirrors emptied. And in the throne room, Dracula sat forward for the first time that night. His hands, so still for so long, curled slowly around the arms of his chair. His pale eyes narrowed. His centuries of confidence, so unshakable an hour ago, began to shift, only slightly, only inwardly, the way a tower shifts before it falls. He understood, now, that he was not fighting a stronger monster. He was fighting a witness. And witnesses, unlike monsters, could not be intimidated, could not be corrupted, could not be bought. They could only be answered. And Dracula, for the first time in his long, terrible life, was not sure he had an answer. Spawn did not climb toward the throne. he descended. He had felt the pull from the moment he stepped through the gates, a low subsonic hum beneath the stone, a pressure in the marrow of the mountain itself. Whatever Dracula pretended to guard from his tall chair upstairs, the real secret of the castle lived below. And so Spawn went down, past the crypts, past the older crypts, past the oldest crypts, past the wine cellars where no wine had ever been stored, past the chapel that had been built upside down, past the archive where the pages of the books turned themselves whenever a visitor looked away. Down and down again, into a stairwell that had no railing and no end, until at last he stepped through an archway carved from a stone that did not match any stone in the mountain above. The chamber on the other side was older than the castle. It was older than the family Dracula had once belonged to. It was older, perhaps, than the mountain itself. The walls were smooth and black, and covered from floor to ceiling in symbols. Not writing exactly, not language exactly, something in between, something that predated both. The symbols pulsed, very faintly, in a rhythm that matched no heartbeat Spawn had ever encountered, and yet felt disturbingly familiar. He recognized the shape of the pact even before he read the terms. He had seen pacts like this before. He had signed one himself. At the center of the chamber, sunk into the floor, lay a circular seal the size of a small courtyard. Its surface was dark, but not empty. Beneath it faintly thousands of small lights moved. They were not fireflies. They were not lanterns. They were faces. They pressed against the underside of the seal like drowning swimmers pressing against the ice of a frozen lake, and they had been pressing there for centuries. Spawn understood at once. Every death in this valley for 500 years. Every traveler who had disappeared into the forest. Every villager whose bed had been found empty. Every soldier, every merchant, every priest, every child who had been taken through the gates of this castle and never seen again. They were all here, not in heaven, not in hell. Here, trapped, fuel. He heard Dracula's footsteps behind him. The vampire had descended too. He no longer moved through his walls or spoke through his corridors. He came in person, robed in black, his face composed into the calm mask of a nobleman receiving an unwelcome guest in his private library. He did not attack. He did not threaten. He walked to the edge of the seal and looked down at the faces beneath the glass, and for a long moment he seemed almost fond of them, the way a shepherd is fond of a flock he has forgotten the names of. He spoke first. He said that Spawn had found the heart of the castle. He said that few had, and none had survived the finding. He said this with the tone of a man complimenting a rival on a clever move in a game they were both certain he would still win. Then he explained. He said that immortality was never a gift. He said that no creature in creation had ever been given eternity without paying for it. He said that in the earliest years of his second life, when he had still believed himself powerful, he had discovered that his strength was not his own. His pact was older than his memory. Something had approached him in a dream that was not a dream, and it had offered him a bargain, and he had signed it in a language he did not know. He had traded pieces of his humanity, he said, one small piece at a time, in exchange for centuries. Each victim he took strength in both himself and the thing that lived beneath the castle. Each soul added to the reservoir. Each reservoir added to his years. He said all of this without shame. He said it the way an accountant reads a ledger. He believed, deeply, that the arithmetic justified itself. Immortality, he said, was worth any price, because immortality was the only thing that mattered. Everything else was decoration. Love was decoration. Guilt was decoration. Judgment, he repeated, was decoration. Spawn looked at him for a long time. Then he looked back down at the seal. He said that Dracula had misunderstood his own bargain. Dracula believed he had bought eternity. Spawn saw something else. He saw a warden who believed he owned the prison. He saw a man who had spent 5 centuries feeding a hunger that was not his own, and had mistaken the hunger's contentment for his own power. The thing beneath the castle, whatever it was, had never given Dracula anything. It had only borrowed him. It had used his name, his hands, his mouth, his kingdom, to gather souls it could not gather for itself. And when Dracula was finally spent, when there were no more villages left to drain, the thing would take the last soul in the chamber, and it would be his. Dracula did not answer immediately. His silence was long. When he did speak, his voice was smaller than it had been in the throne room. He said that immortality was still worth it. He said that even if Spawn's reading of the pact was correct, even if he was, in some final accounting, a servant rather than a master, the years had still been his. The kingdoms had still been his. The pleasures had still been his. He had still watched the world change from a window no one else had lived long enough to sit at. And he said, more quietly, that the souls in the seal were not prisoners. They were preserved. He had given them, he insisted, a form of immortality of their own. They had not vanished into heaven. They had not been consumed by hell. They were here, held. Spawn shook his head. Onche, slowly. He said that what Dracula called preservation, the souls called silence. And silence was not a gift. Silence was a wall. And walls, however old, however clever, however carefully mortared with 5 centuries of stolen years, could be broken. He raised his hand. His chain touched the edge of the seal. The chamber trembled. The symbols on the walls flickered. The faces beneath the glass, so long still, so long silent, began, one by one, to look up. Dracula's composure finally broke. He shouted. For the first time that night, he told Spawn to stop. He told him that if the seal broke, the castle would fall. He told him that if the seal broke, his own body would follow it. He told him, in words half angry and half pleading, that these souls were the only thing keeping him alive. Spawn looked at him. His voice was quiet again. He said that this had never been a rescue mission for Dracula. It had always been a rescue mission for them. And the first crack in the seal spread outward like a river finding a lower path. Dracula abandoned the mask. There had been a version of himself, upstairs in the throne room, who could still play the nobleman, still speak in measured tones, still pretend that this confrontation was a philosophical dispute between 2 immortals with different tastes. That version died the instant the first crack ran across the seal. What rose in its place was older, uglier, and far more honest. The castle answered him before he spoke. Walls that had breathed in illusions during the labyrinth phase now began to bleed in earnest. Dark rivulets seeped from the joints of the stones and ran down toward the seal like water finding its master. Corridors reshaped themselves without pretense of subtlety, folding and unfolding like the jaws of something that had grown tired of chewing its food politely. Statues that had stood in silent alcoves for centuries stepped forward, their marble skin cracking away to reveal the corded muscle of things that had been sealed inside them since the castle was built. The floors themselves gave up their long-hoarded dead. Hands pushed through the flagstones. Faces followed. Whole bodies, half stone and half flesh, dragged themselves upright in the corridors and turned their empty eyes toward the intruder. And above all of it, above the mountain, above the storm, the sky itself changed. The clouds were shoved aside by something inside them, and what remained was a dome of dull arterial red that pulsed once, twice, and then held, casting the whole valley in the color of an old wound. Dracula stepped away from the seal and rose. He rose in every sense of the word. His feet left the floor. His robes tore from his shoulders. His skin darkened, then split, then reformed into something that was no longer skin. Bones lengthened. A rib cage widened until it could have sheltered a small horse. Wings unfolded from his back, not the polite operatic wings of the old paintings, but great ragged sails of leather and vein, spanning half the chamber, dragging their tips through the black water that had begun to pool on the floor. His face lost its human proportions. His jaw extended. His eyes multiplied briefly and then settled back to 2, but the 2 that remained were no longer the eyes of a nobleman. They were the eyes of a thing that had never quite been human, that had only worn a human shape because a human shape was useful for feeding. And from every corner of the castle, from every century of his long career, his vampires came. They came from the Crusades, still wearing the crosses they had betrayed. They came from the courts of forgotten kings, still dressed in the silks of their assassinations. They came from the plague years, thin as reeds, hungry as memory. They came from the last century, more recent, more upright, still pretending at civilization. They came in ranks, in swarms, in single silent figures gliding along the ceilings. The corridors filled with them until there was no floor, no wall, no air that did not contain a pair of teeth. Spawn met them where they came. He no longer moved like a man walking through a building. He moved like weather. The chains at his shoulders had woken fully now, and they were no longer content to strike one enemy at a time. They lashed out in wide, sweeping arcs that cleared entire staircases in a single motion. His cloak spread behind him like a second army, its edges dissolving into the shape of hands, faces, watching mouths. The green fire around his shoulders climbed higher and turned, at the tips, almost white. He fought across towers whose upper floors had already begun to sag inward. He fought across burning courtyards where the flagstones had cracked open and released more of Dracula's forgotten prisoners into the fight, some of them turning on the vampires the moment they were free. He fought across bridges of stone that groaned and split beneath him and forced him to leap the last distance through curtains of red rain. And behind him, always behind him, the seal in the lower chamber continued to fracture, and each new crack in the stone was answered by a fresh crack in Dracula's composure. Because the souls were leaving. They rose through the floors in thin, pale streams, at first only a few, then dozens, then hundreds. They passed through the walls of the castle as though the walls were curtains. They passed through the bodies of the fighting vampires as though the vampires were nothing at all. They rose up into the red sky and vanished, one after another. And every one that vanished took with it a small piece of the strength that had held Dracula together for 500 years. He felt it the way a man feels blood leaving a wound he cannot see. His transformations began to stutter. The great winged form he had summoned started to shrink, then swell, then shrink again. His voice, when he roared, cracked in the middle. His movements, once impossibly fast, developed a half-second hesitation that no vampire of his age had any business showing. He was not merely losing a fight. He was losing the arithmetic that had kept him alive. In desperation, he did the one thing he had sworn never to do. He tried to feed on Spawn. He crossed a burning courtyard in a single leap, folded his wings around the smaller figure, and drove his fangs into the place where a mortal throat would have been. The green fire flared, the chains screamed, and for one long, dazzled instant, Dracula tasted power the like of which he had not tasted in centuries, and he thought, with the last flicker of his old arrogance, that he had won. Then he saw them, every soul Spawn had ever carried. Not the ones he had taken, the ones he had failed. He saw a woman burning in an alley. He saw a child in a doorway who had not made it to the doorway in time. He saw a soldier in a desert. He saw a mother in a hospital. He saw a stranger on a bridge whose name Spawn had never learned, but whose face he had never forgotten. Face after face after face, not as numbers, not as trophies, not as prey, but as individuals, each with a name Spawn still knew, each with a debt Spawn still carried, each with a weight Spawn had chosen, deliberately to keep. Dracula recoiled. He had expected darkness. He had expected the sour, familiar taste of another predator's kills. Instead, he had tasted responsibility. He had tasted the willingness to remember. And it burned him more thoroughly than any holy water any priest had ever thrown in his direction. He tore himself free. He staggered back across the courtyard, his wings trembling, his mouth blackened, his eyes wide. He understood, at last, the shape of the creature he had chosen to insult. Spawn's power was not the mirror of his own. Dracula had spent 5 centuries using immortality to escape judgment. Spawn had spent his shorter, harder existence using supernatural power to accept it. The contrast was not decorative. It was structural. It was the reason the seal was cracking. It was the reason the souls were rising. It was the reason the sky was already beginning to pale at its edges, though dawn was still hours away. Dracula, for the first time, looked up at his own castle and saw it clearly. It was not a fortress. It was a debt. And somewhere in the burning courtyard, through the smoke and the wings and the escaping souls, he heard Spawn's quiet voice again, and it said only one thing. It said that the bill had come due. Dracula ran. He would never have used that word for it, not even to himself, but that was what it was. He folded his wings around what was left of his body and dropped through a hole in the courtyard that had not existed a moment before. And the castle closed over him like a mouth. The stone sealed. The fire above went out. The remaining vampires, without their master's will to hold them together, scattered into the darker corners of the mountain and, in most cases, were never seen again. Spawn stood alone in the burning ruin of the upper castle for a long moment. Then he stepped into the hole. He did not fall. Falling was for creatures who did not know where they were going. He descended, the way a diver descends, the way a priest descends into an old crypt to say a prayer over something that has been waiting to be spoken to. The chain at his side coiled and uncoiled in slow rhythm as he moved. The green fire at his shoulders dimmed to a low, watchful glow. And around him, the walls of the shaft peeled away from stone into something else, something older, something not built by human hands. He arrived in a place that did not have a name. It was not the Chamber of the Seal. The Chamber of the Seal had been the door. This was what lay behind the door. It was a landscape rather than a room, though the difference between the two words dissolved quickly. Above him there was no ceiling and no sky. Instead there was a vast, slow rotation of clouds the color of dried blood, and through the clouds occasionally the suggestion of larger shapes, things that might have been mountains, and might have been faces, and might have been the ribs of something dead and enormous, curled around the whole region like the skeleton of a god that had been buried in its own weather. Below him there was ground, but the ground remembered other purposes. In some places it was flagstone. In some places it was the polished marble of a cathedral floor. In some places it was earth. In some places it was water, though the water did not behave like water. Rivers of dark energy moved through the landscape in slow, deliberate curves, and where they passed, the ground beneath them was worn smooth by centuries of the same motion. The rivers did not lead to a sea. They led to statues. The statues were the worst of it. They were enormous. They were carved in the shape of no god Spawn recognized, and yet they carried the postures of gods. Some knelt, some stood. Some sat on thrones larger than villages, their stone eyes closed, their stone hands folded across stone laps. The rivers of dark energy fed into them, poured into the seams at their wrists, at their throats, at the corners of their eyes, and the statues, though motionless, seemed to be drinking. Around their feet, in the shadows of their ankles, thousands upon thousands of pale figures crowded together, not moving, not speaking, only waiting. Souls. More souls than the seal upstairs had ever contained. Souls that had been fed into this place for so long that the seal had only ever been the drain, not the reservoir. Spawn understood then that the castle had been a small operation. This was the real business. Dracula was already waiting for him. He stood at the center of the landscape on a low rise of black stone between two of the rivers. He had rebuilt himself. His wings were smaller now, tighter, more economical. His human shape had returned, though only barely, only as a kind of mask stretched over the thing beneath. His eyes had steadied. His voice, when he spoke, was almost calm again. He said that Spawn had followed him further than any hunter in 5 centuries. He said that he was, in his own strange way, impressed. He said that this place was the truth of him, the thing he had been building for so long that even he had forgotten, on some nights, that he was building it. He said that the plan had never been simply to live forever. Forever, he had discovered, was cheap. What he had wanted, all along, was to become something that no judgment could reach. Not vampire, not demon, not human. A fourth thing. A creature so laced through with borrowed souls that heaven could not summon it, hell could not claim it, and death could not find it. He said, with something that might once have been pride and was now closer to hunger, that he was almost there. Spawn recognized the ambition. He had seen it before in hell on faces that no longer entirely had faces. It was the ambition of a creature that had realized too late that the trap it had built for others had, all along, been shaped exactly like itself. Dracula attacked. The battle that followed did not obey the geometry of the castle above. There were no stairs to fight up, no towers to fall from, no bridges to cross. There was only landscape, and the landscape rearranged itself according to whichever of them had the stronger will at any given moment. When Dracula was ascendant, the ground tilted, the rivers rose, the statues opened their eyes. When Spawn was ascendant, the sky lightened at its edges, the rivers slowed, the statues closed their eyes again as though embarrassed to be seen. Chains met claws. Necroplasm met old blood. Spawn wrapped his chain around Dracula's throat and pulled him through a cathedral wall that dissolved into ash the instant it broke. Dracula tore free, split himself into a flock of dark shapes, reassembled behind Spawn, and drove a talon into a place where Spawn's spine should have been. Spawn absorbed the blow, turned, and answered it with a strike that sent Dracula through one of the statues, and the statue, for the first time in its long silence, cracked. They fought across impossible distances. They fought across the same ground repeatedly, because the ground did not always remember it had already been fought across. They fought until the rivers were disturbed, and the souls at the feet of the statues began, in confused ripples, to lift their heads. And every time Dracula fell, he rose again. But something was happening. Spawn began to notice it before Dracula did. Each time the vampire lord pulled himself back together, a small piece failed to reassemble. A memory, a gesturi, a tilt of the head that had once been characteristic. The first time Dracula rose from a killing blow, he laughed, and the laugh was old and knowing. The second time he rose, he laughed again, but the laugh was thinner. The third time he did not laugh at all. His face, when he rebuilt it, was slightly less human than it had been the time before. His voice, when he spoke, had lost some of its music. His eyes, when they focused, took a fraction of a second longer. He was still immortal. He was still difficult to kill. But immortality was not free. It had never been free. Each resurrection cost him a fragment, and the fragments were adding up. The prince in the last mortal portrait, the young man with the trace of doubt in his eyes, was slipping further away with every fall. At one point, in the middle of the fight, Dracula stopped. He stood very still on the black stone. He looked down at his own hands. He turned them over slowly, as though he could not remember whose hands they were. And for one small, terrible moment his face went blank, not with rage, not with strategy, but with the simple, awful confusion of a man who had forgotten why he had begun. Spawn did not strike. He waited. He had been waiting, in one form or another, for centuries longer than Dracula suspected. And in that pause, the first true crack appeared in the vampire's identity, and the landscape around them, quietly, began to prepare itself for judgment. The pause did not last. Nothing in Dracula's long career had ever taught him to sit inside a moment of doubt, and he did what he had always done when a doubt tried to settle. He devoured it. He reached out with his will and pulled every remaining thread of borrowed power in the landscape into himself. The rivers of dark energy bent from their courses. The statues shivered as their long meals were interrupted. The pale figures at their feet cried out silently all at once. And Dracula, at the center of the black stone rise, swelled into something the mountain had never seen before. He became a cathedral of himself. His body stretched upward until his shoulders brushed the rotating clouds, and his shoulders were no longer shoulders, but a landscape of overlapping bone plates studded with the sigils of the pact. His wings unfurled until they touched the horizons on either side and beyond them. His face, if it could still be called a face, split into a series of concentric rings of teeth, each ring turning slowly against the ring beneath, so that his mouth was less a mouth than a machine. From within that machine, when he spoke, 5 voices spoke at once, and none of them were the voice of the mortal prince in the last portrait. He said that he could not be judged. He said it with a certainty that had once been true and was now only loud. He said that morality was a story told by short-lived creatures to comfort themselves in the dark. He said that humans had invented judgment because they were afraid of death, and immortality had lifted him above that fear, and therefore above the story, and therefore above any court that had ever been imagined by any tongue on any world. He said 5 times at once that he was the exception. Spawn looked up at the cathedral of him. He was not afraid. He had stopped being afraid a long time ago in a place much worse than this. The green fire at his shoulders had settled into a steady, patient burn. His chain hung loose at his side. His cloak, behind him, moved in a wind that had nothing to do with weather, he answered quietly. He did not raise his voice, and the landscape carried it anyway. He said that Dracula had misunderstood the point of judgment. Judgment was not the invention of the short-lived. It was not a comfort against death. It was the shape that responsibility took when a life was long enough for its choices to become visible. Mortals, he said, had invented courts because they had not been given enough time to face their own choices individually. Immortality had not lifted Dracula above that. It had only given him more time in which to be responsible. And Dracula had spent every additional minute pretending the time did not count. Immortality, he said, did not free anyone from consequences. It only gave them more space in which to face them. Then he moved. The battle that followed was mythic in the true sense of the word, which is to say that it did not obey the physics of any particular era. Spawn's chain uncoiled to a length it had never reached before, spiraling around the cathedral of Dracula like a rope around a tower, and where the chain touched, the sigils of the pact blistered and split. Dracula's wings tore at the sky, and the sky tore back. Necroplasmic energy, no longer a thin green fire but a wide, deep, roaring column of it, met the ancient vampiric magic head-on, and where the two forces met, the landscape flattened itself into pale, silent ash for a mile in every direction. They fought in the way that gods fight in old poems, which is to say that the fight itself became part of the geography. Rivers were bent, statues fell. Clouds broke apart and reformed as they were pushed through by the passage of Dracula's wings. The pale figures at the feet of the statues, freed from the machinery, began, one by one, to look up at the two figures fighting above them, and for the first time in centuries, they began to hope. But the real battle was not in the sky. The real battle was inside Dracula. Spawn drove his chain deep into the cathedral of him, not to tear him down, but to hold him still. And once he was still, Spawn did something no hunter in 5 centuries had thought to do. He reached into Dracula's memory, not with violence, with patience. He took hold of the ledger of Dracula's long career, and he opened it, one page at a time, and he refused to let the vampire look away. He showed him the first. A young girl in a village whose name Dracula had long since erased from his own mind. She had a small dog that had followed her to the market. She had a mother who had waited 3 days by the door, unable to accept that her daughter would not come home. Dracula had not remembered her at all before this moment. Now he remembered every detail, her name, the color of her ribbon, the weight of her hand in his the moment she had realized what he was. He showed him the second. A soldier who had lost his brother in a war and had traveled 200 miles to find work in a strange town and had found the wrong inn on the wrong night. Dracula had drained him in 3 swallows and forgotten him by breakfast. Now he could not forget him at all. He saw the letter the soldier had been carrying, the one addressed to his mother, the one that had never been delivered. He saw the mother waiting. He showed him the 3rd, and the 4th, and the 40th, and the 400th, the families. The children turned into servants who had once been someone's brother, someone's sister. The rulers who had made bad decisions because Dracula had whispered in their ears and had not remembered whispering. The rival vampires he had destroyed because they had been beautiful and beautiful things had irritated him. The priests he had corrupted because their faith had irritated him more. The travelers, the merchants, the farm boys, the old women, the infants. Every one of them, not as a statistic, not as a paragraph in a ledger, but as a face, as a name, as a small specific weight. Dracula tried to look away. He could not. Spawn's chain held him still, and Spawn's will held his gaze, and the memories came anyway, in a long, slow flood, decade after decade, century after century. And somewhere in the middle of that flood, the emotion Dracula had spent 500 years successfully avoiding finally reached him. It was not fear. He had been ready for fear. It was regret. It arrived quietly, the way rain arrives after a very long drought, and it soaked into every crack in his identity, and it did not stop. The cathedral of him began to shrink. The 5 voices thinned to 3, and then to 2, and then to 1. The wings folded. The rings of teeth slowed and one by one closed. He understood, at last, what had happened to him. Death had never been his punishment. Death had been the escape he had spent 5 centuries fleeing from. His true punishment had been the thing he had believed to be his greatest achievement. Living forever with everything he had done, carrying every face he had refused to see, being awake night after night for the full unedited weight of himself. He looked for the last time at Spawn, and Spawn quietly delivered judgment. He did not destroy him. Destruction was a mercy, and mercy, in this particular case, would have been a lie. Instead, he turned his chain toward the statues, toward the rivers, toward the pale figures at the feet of the old gods, and he broke every seal that Dracula had ever laid. The souls rose. The cathedral of Dracula, no longer fed, no longer held together by the borrowed weight of other people's lives, began, slowly and with terrible dignity, to fall in on itself. The landscape beneath the castle did not end all at once. It ended the way an old song ends, one note at a time, each note quieter than the last. The rivers of dark energy slowed and then reversed, drawing back toward the statues that had drunk from them for so long, and the statues, without their meals, cracked from within. First the smallest ones, the ones at the outer edges, fell into piles of broken stone that had nothing supernatural about them anymore. Then the middle ranks. Then the largest, the ones whose knees had been the size of hills, tilted very slowly and lay down in the ash. The clouds above lost their red. They did not turn to any other color. They simply thinned and continued thinning until they were not clouds anymore, but only the memory of clouds, dispersing into a wide open dark, and the souls rose. There were more of them than Spawn had counted. There were more of them than Dracula had counted. They came in streams from the feet of the fallen statues, in wide slow rivers from the drained beds of the black waters, in single quiet figures who had been standing so still for so long that even the landscape had forgotten they were there. They passed through Spawn as they rose, and where they passed they left small blessings on the edges of his cloak, small warmth against the green fire, small unspoken thanks that he did not require and did not refuse. They did not linger. They had waited long enough. They rose up through what had been sky and had now become only a direction, and they were gone. Above, in the world of stone and weather, the castle answered them. It had stood on that mountain for 1,000 years. It had watched kingdoms come and go beneath it. It had housed a creature who had believed for 5 centuries that no wind and no fire and no army would ever bring it down. And now, without a single arrow fired at it, without a single trebuchet drawn up against its walls, it began quietly to die. The disintegration was not violent at first. A tower on the east side leaned. A section of the outer wall on the north side sagged, then folded, then dropped in a soft avalanche of stone into the forest below, disturbing no one. The great gates at the base of the mountain, which had opened only a few hours before to admit a stranger who had walked in as though expected, sank quietly off their hinges and lay flat in the mud. The corridors inside sighed and settled. The crypts, one by one, closed themselves for the last time, and would not open again for anything. Then the fires came, but they were not fires of destruction. They were fires of release. Green light climbed the walls in slow, patient veins, tracing the seams of the pact wherever it had been laid. Where the light touched, the stones did not shatter. They simply forgot they had ever been held together. They fell away in a fine, dry rain of dust. The surviving vampires ran. Some of them tried, at first, to fight the fires. They threw themselves at the green light and vanished into it. Others tried to bargain with the ruins, calling out to walls and doors that no longer heard them, most simply fled. They poured out of the lower gates in dark, low-running shapes and scattered into the forest, and the forest, which had been afraid of them for 1,000 years, did not stop them. It let them go the way a farmer lets birds go from a barn he is about to burn down. Some of them, running, felt the first true dawn of their lives approaching from the east, and understood, for perhaps the first time, that they had never actually seen the sun. Spawn walked back up through the ruins as they fell. He did not hurry. There was no need. The castle was polite enough to give him a path. Corridors held themselves upright a moment longer as he passed. Staircases waited to collapse until his foot had left the last step. Doors that were about to burn opened for him first, and burned afterward. The chains at his shoulders moved in a slow, regular rhythm, as though counting off the last seconds of a very long sentence. He found Dracula in what had been the throne room. The throne itself was gone. The high chair that had watched 1,000 years of confessions had folded in on itself early, as though embarrassed to be present at the end. The great hall around it was open to the sky now, its ceiling gone, its walls half fallen. And in the middle of the floor, on the bare stones where the throne had once stood, Dracula sat. He was smaller than he had ever been. His body had returned, more or less, to the shape of the man in the last mortal portrait, though the shape was thinner now, and older, and stripped of the trappings of centuries. His hands were bare, his feet were bare. His hair, no longer arranged in the careful style of a nobleman, hung around a face that looked, for the first time in 500 years, like it belonged to someone who had once been a son. He looked up when Spawn arrived, and he did not rise. He asked quietly why Spawn had not simply killed him. His voice was thin. It was not the voice from the throne. It was not the voice from the cathedral of himself. It was the voice, Spawn suspected, of the young man in the old portrait, the one with the trace of grief in his eyes, the one who had once been a prince and had not yet been a monster. The voice that had been buried under 5 centuries of other voices and had finally, in the ruins of everything he had built, been allowed to speak again. Spawn answered him. He said that death would have been an escape. He said that Dracula had spent 500 years running away from death. And to give it to him now, quickly and cleanly, would have been to give him the one thing he had always wanted. He said that Dracula's true treasure had never been his kingdom, or his castle, or his armies. It had been his immortality. And so Spawn had taken from him the only thing that had ever made that immortality matter: the stolen power, the borrowed years, the reservoir of other people's lives, everything that had allowed him to believe himself beyond judgment. What was left, he said, was only Dracula, whatever that was. He said that Dracula would sit here, in the ruins, for whatever time remained to him. He said that it might be a night, it might be an hour, it might be less. He said that he did not know, and that it did not matter. The one thing he could promise was that in whatever time was left, Dracula would be alone with the memories that Spawn had opened in him. Not as a punishment invented for the occasion, only as the inheritance of 5 centuries of choices. Dracula did not answer. He looked down at his own hands again, as he had in the landscape below, and this time he did not turn them over. He only looked at them. Spawn turned and walked away. Behind him the last of the seal broke. Somewhere deep beneath the mountain, and the last of the souls, the ones who had been the deepest, the oldest, the most forgotten, rose in a single slow column into the paling sky. The column passed through what remained of the castle without disturbing a stone. It passed through the surviving vampires, and where it touched them, some of them stopped running and lay down in the forest and did not get up. It passed through the villagers, hidden in their cellars, and none of them ever spoke of what they felt in that moment, though several of them, for the rest of their lives, would weep whenever they saw a sunrise. And the first sunrise in 500 years reached the valley. The survivors emerged from their cellars. They stood in their doorways in the pale gold light, holding on to each other, looking up at the mountain where a castle had stood for as long as any of their grandmothers could remember. There was no castle now, only smoke, only a low, quiet fire, only the shape of something that had finally been allowed to fall. The forest was quiet, the mountain was quiet. And for the first time in the memory of anyone alive, no one in the valley was afraid of the mountain. Months passed, then a year, then more. The villagers rebuilt. They rebuilt slowly at first because they did not trust the quiet, and then more quickly once the quiet held. New roofs went up over old walls. New chapels were raised in places where the old chapels had faced the wrong direction for too long. Children were born who would grow up hearing the name of the mountain and feeling no shiver at all, because for them the mountain had always been only a mountain. But the story traveled. It moved the way stories always move, in fragments, along the roads between villages, along the trade routes between valleys, along the whispered gossip of monks who had heard it from travelers, who had heard it from grandmothers, who had lived through it. By the time it reached the great cities of Europe, it had already changed a dozen times. Some said an angel had descended on the mountain and destroyed the vampire's castle with a sword of white fire. Some said a demon had come to fight another demon, and the smaller demon had won. Some said the castle had simply chosen to fall, tired at last of its master, and had shrugged him off the way a horse shrugs off a rider who has ridden it too long. The survivors, when they were asked, said only what they had seen: a dark figure, chains that moved like living things, a green fire that had climbed the walls of the castle without burning the forest around it, a silence afterward so deep that some of them had cried in it. The name Spawn was rarely spoken. When it was spoken quietly, the way people speak the names of things they are not certain they are allowed to name. Fragments of Dracula's history began to disappear from the human records. Portraits were unhooked from the walls of noble houses and, when no one was looking, misplaced. Chronicles were rewritten, sometimes deliberately, sometimes only because the newer scribes could not quite remember why the older scribes had considered a particular castle so important. Within a generation, most of Europe no longer knew whose castle had stood on that mountain. Within two, the mountain itself began to be known by a different name. But one small mystery remained. Deep beneath the ruins, deeper than the crypts, deeper than the chamber of the seal, in a fold of stone that even Spawn had not thought to open, a single vampire woke. He had slept there for so long that he did not remember his own name. He had been placed there by Dracula in the 1st century of the Pact as a kind of insurance, and forgotten. He rose now into an emptiness he did not understand. He climbed, slowly, through corridors that no longer led anywhere. He emerged, at last, into what had been the throne room. There was no throne. There was no Dracula. There was no army. There was only sky above him and grass already growing between the fallen stones. He looked around. He waited. He listened. There was nothing to hear. Far away, on another mountain, Spawn stood at the edge of a cliff and looked out over a valley he had never been to before. The last of the souls he had freed had long since gone. His work in this country was over. His cloak moved in a wind he did not entirely feel, and the chain at his side hung quiet. He did not smile. He rarely smiled. But he understood, in the calm way that he understood most things now, that the story of this castle was ending, and that another story, somewhere else, had already begun. There would always be another monster. There would always be another tyrant. There would always be another soul caught between justice and damnation, waiting for a witness patient enough to arrive. He turned from the valley and walked into the dark, and the dark, which had grown used to him, made room. Behind him, in the country he had left, in the mountains where the villagers no longer bolted their doors after sunset, the legend settled into its final shape. Dracula had spent 500 years believing himself beyond judgment. He had believed it so completely and for so long that he had built a castle to hold the belief, and a pact to feed the castle, and a kingdom of stolen years to feed the pact. And then, one night, in the middle of a storm that had risen from the mountain itself, judgment had come walking through his front door. Dracula had spent 500 years escaping death. He never understood that death was not what had come for him. Judgment was.